For those of you who attend these conferences or have attended them for the last 10 years, you've probably heard my speech on privatization. But I have been a huge proponent of trying to implement administrative settlements that take cases out of the tort system and allow the parties to administratively process those cases. And for the last, I'd say since the early 90s, I was very successful in creating these administrative settlements that basically settled my entire inventory of cases. And I created an administrative program through the negotiations with the defendants on settling these cases and what the criteria would be for a new case to be processed and successfully paid through that administrative program. So it cleared the entire backlog of cases that were filed in court, and then when I had a new case, this administrative program would then kick in and the case would be filed, but the court would never see the case because it would be settled against that defendant. I was basically able to effectuate this with about 75% of the defendants in the litigation up until about 2000. In fact, Judy represented a group of defendants, 24 different defendants, and we had this arrangement from the late 80s until they broke up in the early 2000s. So this was what I termed the privatization theory, and the reason that I termed it that was because these cases never entered the tort system. They were settled by a private administrative program, and then any issues that arose in that private administrative program were dealt with outside the tort system through an ADR process. And I can't tell you how successful this was for almost a decade, and basically it's come to an absolute halt. And there are no more of these type of systems, and these type of settlements. And that's one of the first things that I'd like to talk about today with John and Judy, and ask you why you think that the carriers and the companies are not looking to do these type of administrative settlements anymore, where for years I was persuading boards of directors and companies and insurance carriers that they basically could settle these cases for the same amount of money they're spending on the transaction costs, and they don't have any exposure of compensatory punitive damages. But for some reason, and I'd like you guys to talk about that, that is not resonating anymore. Judy?
Well, in terms of the administrative deals, or a big deal like that, many of the defendants that are in the litigation now are in substantially different postures than those defendants. You're suing dental tape dental tape manufacturers or printing press manufacturers who are going to be in very few and isolated cases. And it doesn't make sense for them, I think. They have a different business model, if you want to call it that, than a company that might be legitimately sued in perhaps tens of thousands of cases. It's a substantially different thing. Those companies that find themselves in what we might call a one-off case, they're going to need much different information. They're going to have to, in their own minds, they have to adjust themselves to the idea that they're going to be paying a lot of money in a case, or what they regard as a lot of money. And coming up with a deal that really takes care of your inventory isn't going to work for those kinds of cases. It's not going to work for those kinds of defendants.
Well, I agree with you with respect to those kind of defendants, but there are still many defendants in litigation that are in a broad spectrum of cases and will remain in them through summary judgment that the system that type of system can work for, and I just don't see it resonating even with them, and quite frankly, even with the defendants that you just mentioned. Yes, there are defendants in the litigation that are in a lot less cases, and that's proper. But even for them, the amount of money that's being spent on transaction costs, and then to have to deal with the possible exposure of a verdict, and eventually that happens, or even the amount of money that they pay when they take the case into the courtroom, because the dollars go up. They can't be discounted anymore because the plaintiffs have spent money on preparing the case. It just seems to me that by not having to spend the transaction costs, the discount that's inherited in settling the case early would bring those people to the table, and they're not coming to the table.
Well, that's funny you raise that, because I would say obviously a 50% discount early on would get a lot of us moving to settle a lot of cases. But I think it gets, we heard this morning, and it gets talked about and bandied about that it's the carriers don't want to settle anything until it's on the courthouse stairs. The companies don't want to do that. And I actually think to some degree that's a fiction that's been created by the plaintiffs' bar. I really do. And I think one of the impediments to early settlements here, and Judge Moss, I'm not going to holler, but I do think, like Citrillo said this morning, one of the impediments to early settlement is from your side of the aisle. And I think you don't get to the defendants the information that they need fast enough. And these days, it's not just to evaluate a case. Most every company is going to be audited by an insurance company at some point, and they literally have to pull out of their files and show the carrier why they paid what they paid in a case. They can't pay on cases without that kind of backup, and the carriers have gotten much more difficult about that. So the information that's needed by the defendants in these cases is substantially greater. I also think that when you start talking about settling cases early with plaintiffs, they have to get serious about the numbers. And we've seen this time and time again on my side. We do want to talk about cases before they're set for trial. And when we ask a plaintiff to talk about a case before trial, either the plaintiff's lawyer really doesn't know their inventory, doesn't really know their case, or in an abundance of caution is afraid that they're going to get closer to trial and they will let you out for too little money, or they won't have enough pockets to pick at the end. And I think that we get these artificially high demands. And it's very difficult for us to talk about cases like that in the face of a demand that is multiples of what we only know the case is ultimately going to settle for. It's too hard to do. So if the plaintiffs got the information that we needed early, and if they were serious about their negotiation, if they knew their inventory, I think pretty much any defendant who knew that they were going to get a discount, could avoid transactional costs and so on, would be interested in negotiating.
John.